All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 23, Section 3, A New Home Front. So during the war, so again, just recall, we were talking about World War I, 1914 through 1919. And one of the major impacts that the war had was at home in the United States. It changed society in a number of ways. First were the new opportunities that the war provided. Recall that a lot of materials were needed in order to fight the war, and to get those materials, you needed to have jobs. And so generally speaking, workers saw a lot of opportunities to get jobs in those industries that were related to producing war-related materials. One way to ensure that the materials continued to be produced was that the U.S. government set up the National Labor Board. This was set up to really negotiate with labor, right? And specifically labor unions like the AFL, which was the largest labor union, and Samuel Gompers, of course, who was the leader of the AFL. And to negotiate with labor to ensure that war-related materials were being produced, and that they were produced or being produced 24/7. Really what the goal of the National Labor Board was to prevent strikes, right? Because if workers go on strike during the war, then those materials are not being produced, and potentially the United States can lose the war. So that's what the board was set up essentially to do. And what workers were able to get out of that was not only better wages, right? So higher pay. This time the U.S. government was willing to foot the bill. You know, the U.S. government was willing to pay really whatever workers demanded, or at least give in to a lot of their demands, to ensure that these materials continued to be produced for the war effort. So better pay, safer conditions. Generally speaking, you know, workers saw an increase to the really to the overall kind of well-being of the workplace than before the war. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, of course, that lasts during the course of the war. When the war ends, there'll be some problems that are born out of what happens to labor when the war is over. But for the time being, generally new opportunities and better opportunities. The war also provided more opportunities to other groups, not just workers who worked in factories, but also to women in general, because so many men went off to war. There were new jobs that were available. Now, these were traditionally male occupations. So it wasn't that women had never worked before. That wasn't the case. It was just there were certain occupations that were dominated only by men. And when those men went off to war, then women were able to fill into those occupations. So it's breaking down sort of a gender stereotypes and gender norms in American society. You also had organizations like the Women's Land Army of America. Members of that organization were called the Farmerettes. These were women who ran farms to produce food. And of course, food was a major necessity in order to keep the war effort going. Here you see a propaganda poster from the Women's Land Army, and here you see a woman working in the railroad industry, and that's probably a good example. Maybe we could put down the railroad industry as an industry in which before the war was completely dominated by men, but because of the war, because there was a shortage, and because demand for materials and goods were much higher, you now had more women working in something like the railroad industry. You also saw women participating in some other ways. Your textbook mentions hello girls. These were phone operators in France who would help answer phones and reroute phones. And of course, Red Cross nurses, or just nurses in general, take care of the wounded. right, take care of the wounded. So a lot of different ways women could participate in this conflict and had a greater role in, in the public arena. Another constituency or another group who saw the war as the opportunity were African Americans, who not only served in the war and served in the war in segregated units, that means white and black soldiers fought separately, but that allowed them then, because the World War I, in Woodrow Wilson's words, was a war to make the world safe for democracy. Well, back at home in the United States, especially in the Jim Crow South, democracy wasn't fully being realized, especially with how African Americans were disenfranchised, despite the fact that you had something like the 15th Amendment. One of the more famous all-black units was the Harlem Hellfighters. This was an all-black U.S. unit that fought in France. And they were one of the most famous units, having very close combat with the German army. Now, even though the war could provide an opportunity for some African Americans, especially African American men, however, back home, the Great Migration continues. Again, the Great Migration is the movement of African Americans from the South to the North. And of course, one of the reasons why this Great Migration took place was because of the discrimination and persecution of the Jim Crow South and the Jim Crow laws. But oftentimes moving was difficult because one needed a destination. Well, the wartime jobs provided economic opportunities for African Americans to leave the South in massive numbers. So these were war jobs that were available. Now, despite the fact that in the North things were much better in the South in terms of things like civil rights and legal rights, so segregation was not the law of the land in the North, there still was discrimination, and there still were problems with some of the white people who had already lived there. In fact, race riots in 1919 broke out across the United States. This is sometimes referred to as the Red Summer of 1919, and this was often because you had a lot more African Americans from the South moving into predominantly white communities, where they would, not just compete over things like housing, but also compete over jobs. And the reason why 1919 especially was because that was the year the war was over. A lot of people were laid off from their jobs, and so that competition for what few jobs remaining was just all the more intense than it was during the other war years. So yes, the North did not have discriminatory laws like the South, but there was still racial discrimination, racial animosity, and also race riots. The last thing that we could say about the war and its impact on the home front, that is at home in the United States, is that it really helped push forward some of the last parts of the progressive movement. We've talked about these things already, but I just want to kind of, this chapter sort of relates how the war helped push these through. Just two: prohibition and universal suffrage. We might call this women's suffrage. Now recall, suffrage is the right to vote, if you're unfamiliar with that term. So both the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, which were, respectively, prohibited the sale, manufacture, or transportation of alcohol, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, these were in part passed because of the war. In the case of prohibition, a very strong anti-German sentiment. The United States was fighting against Germany. This was especially true of many beer producers in the U.S., that by banning alcohol, this was seen as a patriotic duty. And for women, because women had played a much bigger role in World War I, they were in a much better position to argue for the right to vote. In other words, because of women's contributions in World War I, they could make the stronger argument and the stronger demand for the right to vote. And both the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment were passed in 1920, which was just 1 year after the First World War was over.